Wow, what a morning of wonderful, specific ideas. I hope to see a lot of you in a few years in a 60-square-foot house with a green roof and all the vegetables in the front yard. I think Dan Kemmis had a good point last night. We've got to stop and pause and see where we are. I mean, this conference is long and full of wonderful speakers, but we probably should take an hour and run around and jump in the mud and then come back in. But I think you'll get uplifted by the next speaker. David Orr really does not need any introduction. I think almost all of you know who he is. I asked him if there's anything specific he would like me to say about him. He said, please tell the audience that my parole officer says I'm doing much better. Anyway, David has been an inspirational speaker, writer for me. He's big in the environmental field. He's an exciting lecturer. He's never without great new ideas. Help me in welcoming David Orr. Thank you.
You know, you shouldn't have to get up and spend 15 minutes of a talk explaining that your parole officer said no such thing. But actually, he didn't think it was going all that well. And it's a delight to be here. I want to begin with three comments. I want to talk about politics, and I'd like to be optimistic about politics, but I need to make some distinctions, and I want to begin with a letter that was written in the Arkansas Democrat this past spring, and it went like this. You may have noticed that March of this year was particularly hot. As a matter of fact, I understand that it was the hottest March since the beginning of the last century. All the trees were fully leafed out, and legions of bugs and snakes were crawling around during a time in Arkansas when, on a normal year, we might see a snowflake or two. This should come as no surprise to any reasonable person. As you know, daylight savings time started almost a month early this year. You would think that members of Congress would have considered the warming effect that an extra hour of daylight would have on our climate. Or did they? Perhaps this is another plot by a liberal Congress to make us believe that global warming is a real threat. Perhaps next time there should be serious studies performed before Congress passes laws with such far-reaching effects. This was from Connie Muskemon from Hot Springs, Arkansas. Now, at the end of the talk, I do want to talk about politics, and I want to assume with Thomas Jefferson that if people are not up to the issues, rather than taking power from them, we inform their discretion. That's the problem of education. The second thing I want to do is this. I want to make a distinction. I want to level with you. This is the kind of audience that I think we can be honest with one another, and I want to level with you. I've been in a number of gatherings like this where the instructions are to be optimistic. And honesty compels me to say that there is a difference between optimism and hope. And if I could use a metaphor or an analogy, optimism is rather like being a New York Yankees fan. You've got 2 outs in the ninth. You've got Mariano Rivera in his prime on the mound, a 2-strike count on a 200 hitter. And you can be legitimately optimistic that you're going to win the game. Optimism in that case is no more than a prediction that the odds are in your favor. Hope is something different. Hope is like being a Boston Red Sox fan. You've got 2 outs, a runner on second. Mariano Rivera is on the mound, a 200 hitter at the plate, and you're hopeful and you're believing in salvation by small percentages. that guy is going to get a hit and bring in the tie and run. That's hope. Optimism has its feet up on the desk and wears a confident look on its face. Hope has its sleeves rolled up and is about the business of trying to change the odds that it knows are not in its favor. I don't know any reason why anybody in this room, if you know enough, ought to be optimistic or can legitimately be optimistic about the human future. But I have lots of reasons why you and I ought to be hopeful. But hope is a very different thing than optimism, and I want to explain why. This is, wait, somebody needs to help me here. I have hit the wrong thing. Yeah, this is hopeless. All right, there we go. This is an outline of what I would like to do in the 45 minutes ahead. I want to ask the question, what do we tell the people? I'm going to assume that we are of mostly like mind, and the question is, what do we tell people? I have an observation that time, for reasons I'm going to give you, is not our friend. We have already spent the margin of error, whatever that was, that we had 30 years ago. I want to talk about what I think is the heart of the issue, the energy choices and energy policy choices that affect climate. And I want to end on a note about politics, changing the way we think about politics. We've been told for a long time that we're divided between left and right. I don't believe that we are. I think that we're divided between the present generation and future generations, and I'm going to come back to that. This left-right or liberal-conservative split, I think, has always been a bit of a sham. Let me start with climate change. You've seen these figures as much or as long as I have. On the upper left-hand corner, this is the Keeling curve. If there's one curve young people need to know, it is this curve of rising CO2 in the atmosphere. It was 315 parts per million here. Last December, it was 382 parts per million there. But if you extend this down another 650,000 years to the left, it didn't go above 280 parts per million. This graph is from Swiss Re. It's simply a rising level of insurance claims attributable to various kind of climate-driven weather events. The graph on the right is from that environmental rag, Fortune magazine. This is simply a record of hottest hots, wettest wets, driest dries, climate anomalies, all of these things that we're seeing now breaking records. This is from the graph you may have seen. This is from the fourth report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Every 5 years, the world scientific community focused on climate change gets together and issues a report, kind of a summary of findings. And it's always understated because they have to reach a consensus across lots of different people and lots of different countries. This is a graph of probabilities. This applies to this. These apply to these scenarios here. This is the metric. And you can begin to see, or you see here, the predictions that we're in for a much hotter time. We needn't belabor the point. This is the confidence intervals which they believe that this prediction can be made, so that's why the lower peak here, but the odds are pretty good that it's going to get hotter. This is a slide from the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, 50 years out, or by the year 2050, 43 years out. Wheat growing area shifts from this part in the USA to Canada, up on the Canadian Shield where soils are much thinner. This is areas of long-term drought, a graphic taken from the New York Times, and you're all familiar with this more or less, and scenes like this, and this seems to be now a long-term trend. This is from the Stern Review. The British Exchequer issued a report done by Nicholas Stern, a former economist with the World Bank and employee of the British Exchequer. And you'll notice here that this is temperature increases, 1, 2, 3, 4, so forth. And then these are various events that begin to kick in at those temperatures. And we've already warmed the planet by 0.8 degrees centigrade. And you'll notice that some of these things have already begun. You guys are better than mine. You can pick this out. But these are various kind of events. But they're actually beginning to the left of the red line. If we were to stop emitting heat-trapping gases today, we are already committed to another, it's believed, 0.6 of a degree warming. So give or take about 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, it is thought that 2 degrees centigrade warming is the absolute threshold, or it's increasingly believed that 2 degrees centigrade warming is the absolute threshold of safety. And that would translate into perhaps 450 parts per million carbon dioxide. I want to come back to that in just a moment. Now, in this graphic, and it is in the Stern Review, this is published now by Cambridge University Press, or you can download it from the website. But these are also things that are interactive. These are not discrete across these rows. They are going to be interactive, so that as the hydrological cycle shifts, food growing will also change, and so forth. These are what scientists are calling tipping points, climate tipping points. The news from virtually all of these is not particularly good. The issue of methane cleth rates, for example, is a problem. This is number 9 here, is a problem that's related to warming seawater. It's thought that if seawater warms, the methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, that the methane locked in these little ice formations would be given off, and that would be catastrophic, potentially catastrophic for the planet. The news on all of these, however, is not very good. The science, as we learn more and more, the evidence comes back that it, in fact, is more serious than thought even a few years, or in some cases, even a few months ago, in the case of ice melting. These are numbers, and I don't mean to have a conversation with you all about numbers, but these are some that we need to understand. We are at 382 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere as of December of this past year, but the real number, the atmosphere, is indifferent as to source of carbon or the nature of the heat-trapping gas. And so we are already at 430 parts per million CO2 equivalent. So what the Stern report and increasingly climate scientists are giving us is kind of a composite number, taking 6 heat-trapping gases and rendering them all equivalent to carbon dioxide in terms of heat-trapping potential. We're already at 430 parts per million, and adding to that number about 2.5 to 3 parts per million CO2 and other heat-trapping gases per year. So you do the math. When I first got into the climate, or began to read the climate debate at about the time of the second IPCC report in 1995, it was thought that 550 or 560 parts per million CO2 was kind of a threshold, and we ought at that time to do kind of a stop and look-see and see how things were going. Now the consensus among many climate scientists, John Holdren, president of the AAAS, among them, James Hansen of NASA, NOAA, Goddard Space Laboratory, another one, believes that in fact 450 is the last point at which we can be relatively assured of safety. But as an outsider looking in at the climate science, the fact is no one knows for sure. We simply do not know what a safe level is. And it would be very smart to treat this like an emergency. What I think that we can say is this isn't global warming. Our language misleads us very badly here. There are days in Ohio when global warming sounds like a really good thing. It, in fact, is planetary destabilization, with rising sea levels and thermal expansion of water and melting ice, more storms, more severe storms, disease and famine changing, drought and heat waves, changing ecosystems, coral bleaching, political and economic disorder, and a death toll that already exceeds 150,000 per year, according to the World Health Organization. What this means is that we're already committed to substantial warming. We've already warmed the planet again 0.8 degrees centigrade, and were we to stop today, again, we would be at 1.4 to 1.5 degrees centigrade change, a substantial warming. Now, this second item is a real problem for us. There is apparently a lag between the emission of heat-trapping gases, and particularly the long-lived heat-trapping gases, and the weather effects that we see. And that gap is something like apparently 30 to 40 years. Tim Flannery in his book Weathermakers refers to certain gateways or step-level changes. So this is not a curve that goes up like this. It's a step-level change that goes like that. And every time you go up one of these step-level changes, you simply can't go back, or the Earth will not go back in any time span meaningful to us. So there is this lag, and it's very interesting because we went through a step-level change in the late 1970s, according to Tim Flannery and Jim Hansen, but that was at the very time the first warning was given to a U.S. president. That was 1978, and that was 30 years ago. And that is roughly the time at which apparently the carbon was released that helped to amplify Katrina from a Class 1 storm to a Class 5 storm 30 years later. Now, this is hard news, I think, for us to assemble because we're so used to happy news. But it is too late to avoid trauma. For people who live in low-lying areas around the Earth, it's already too late. They're having to abandon homes. We've now abandoned 2 islands. The first 2, I think, that I'm aware of this past year. Other low-lying areas, I spent a long day with some people from Bangladesh several weeks ago. Their homes are now in jeopardy due to rising sea levels and increasing storm surges and so forth. No easy way out. The American mentality is such that we look for silver bullets. It may be, as Bill McKibben says, there may be silver buckshot, but there are no silver bullets. There's simply not, that's not the way the world works. Al Gore, I think, has it right that this is the first planetary emergency. Now, this is the best I can make as a summary of what I have read on climate science. There's no part of this that easily fits the American psyche as people of plenty, as historian David Potter once called us, or our optimism that we're told is part of our cultural DNA. But it happens to be, as best I can tell it, as best I can see it, the truth of what lies ahead. It isn't all over, but it means that we now have to reckon with a very different kind of world. This is a graph taken from Science magazine several weeks ago, and what, if I'm reading correctly, the science correctly, increasingly we're finding that faster and bigger changes and more severe problems are the more likely outcomes. In other words, the right hand of this tail probability distribution. Now, this, to compare this, compare that reality, there is no serious debate, as far as I can understand it, among anybody, including climate skeptics, that if we add enough heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, at some point we will trigger catastrophe. It will be global, it will be permanent as we measure time, and it could destroy civilization. There is simply no debate about that. The debate would come as to where exactly on that continuum that catastrophe might kick in, at what point it becomes a self-reinforcing kind of thing. But compare the response of the country to climate change. Somebody's put a bunch of music on here. Is that, it just went off, so. That may have been to lighten up, you know, let's talk about happier things. There are all kinds of ways to give messages to speakers. But I want you to compare the response we've made to climate change to what we did with the Soviet threat between 1947 and 1990, in which we spent, depending on how you count the money, and what part of the defense budget was directly attributable to the Soviet threat, but somewhere between $10 and $15 trillion, most of which went down a rat hole, frankly. And now we've been through the Soviet archives. We know that there really was no particularly serious threat unless they felt we were about to attack them, in which case they would have preempted the attack, or in the case of a rogue commander launching a strike, but that itself would have been related to that person's perception of our military capabilities and threat posture. But we didn't hesitate in a risk situation that was we now know, far less risky than that of climate change. Or simply compare how we respond as individuals to relatively remote risks of household fire and earthquake and so forth, and medical insurance and car insurance and all of that. The problem is bigger than just climate change, as all of you know. There's 6.5 billion of us on the planet. The word overshoot was part of our lexicon at the beginning of the environmental movement. It's kind of slipped off the agenda now, as has the issue of population. But all of the things on the screen you can read for yourselves, but it isn't just climate change. Climate is the biggest issue on here, and they're all kind of related to each other. But this is a planetary crisis that goes across the board. There is an issue of equity. An article about to come out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science attributes or says that between 1961 and the year 2000, there were roughly $91 trillion of ecological cost. 87% of that was borne by the poor around the planet. And that number, I would expect, would in fact rise in the next few decades. We now know a good bit more about the planet than we did even 5 years ago, or certainly 10 or 20 years ago. We know now that nonlinearity and surprise are part of the way the Earth works. Things don't change gradually, indefinitely. At some point, there are step-level changes, and there are changes where 2 plus 2 equals 22, oftentimes, that we have to reckon with the behavior of complex systems. I'm going to end up talking about governance, but governance, as we devised it in this country and in most every other part of the world, was for much simpler systems, and that was carried out in an agrarian era. But now we have to reckon with planetary governance that has long time frames and complicated systems. There are this problem of leads and lags that cause and effect can be separated very widely in space and time. Then there are the issue that what we think we know about the planet and science and the way nature works tends to obsolesce very rapidly. And then there is this problem of conveying politics or science in a political world in which, roughly half of the American public doesn't believe in the theory of evolution, but does believe that creationism is an adequate explanation. And a third of the public believes in aliens and alien abduction. I'm in that third. I do believe in aliens. I've had some in my family and so forth. Now, here's the heart of the question I want to ask. We're told that we can only give happy news, that talks like this have to be about all the gadgets and all the things that we have, solar power and wind power and an array of things, and I believe that those are real, and I've given those talks myself, and you'll see some of that in this talk in a few moments. But I don't believe that that is an adequate story. The issue that it may not happen, at the worst may not happen, doesn't correspond with what we now see in the science virtually every week in Science Magazine or Nature or Geophysical Letters or any number of other journals. There's a second point, and this, do you remember the movie A Few Good Men, where Tom Cruise, the young JAG attorney, has Jack Nicholson on the stand, and he's saying, "I want you to tell the truth." Do you remember the movie? And Nicholson spits out, "You can't handle the truth." It's one of the great lines in cinematographic history. Maybe the public is like that. T.S. Eliot once hinted the same thing. And maybe we just can't handle much truth. Maybe we're prone more to deny the reality and deny mortality and so forth, and there's a case to be made for that. And maybe if people knew the full story, they would panic. There's another way to think about this, however. Mark Twain said, when in doubt, tell the truth. It amazes your friends and will confound your enemies. Maybe we ought to tell the truth. And the truth is, rather like Churchill described the situation to the British people in 1940, that he had nothing to offer but blood and toil and tears and sweat, and they rallied, they sacrificed, and in the end, they prevailed. And maybe it's time to treat the public as adults. Maybe if we tell the truth, and that was part of the public news, and that was part of the political dialogue in this country, which to this point it still is not in a major way. Maybe the public would mobilize and rally, and we would see things happen that we otherwise would never see. What to tell the public? I'm going to pick up the pace here. Well, the first thing to tell the public is U.S. energy policy has been a 50 or 60-year disaster, perhaps even longer. We subsidize oil and gas and coal by tax breaks and waived royalties and outlays. We spend $74 billion in various ways per year to subsidize energy, 66% to fossil fuels, 12.4% to nuclear, and then we get down here, 7.5% to renewables, but most of that goes to dam work, 2% to conservation. And what does this cost us? Well, it costs us a huge amount. At a time when the Congressional Budget Office is projecting a U.S. deficit by 2050 of $40 to $45 trillion, we can't afford to waste money on a wasteful energy policy. The numbers you can read for yourself, but the last one I would point out, or last two, according to Terry Tamminen, Arnold Schwarzenegger's former environmental advisor, we spend something like $807 billion total per year in excess cost of an energy supply system. And then Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel-winning economist, estimates that the true cost of the Iraqi war, if you measure it out to the year 2030 or so, is going to come in at about $2 trillion. That's an estimate, calculations of which were done 2 years ago. How do we get out of this? Well, this is business as usual. This is deflection downward. It is critical where this point of deflection is. If this is at or near 450 parts per million, maybe we have a good chance. If it comes in after that time, it may not nearly be as good. In a very famous article that appeared in Science magazine and also Scientific American, Rob Sokolow and Stephen Pikala developed a strategy breaking the total issue of climate policy down, or energy policy down, to a series of wedges. And each wedge, implemented over 50 years, would remove 25 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere, or 1 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere. What they left out, although they did leave that blank wedge at the top, but I want to call it suck it up. If we had to go out in your own homes and communities and just observe, let's take a day and just walk around and look at all the energy use and all the things that we buy and consume, including, as we heard this morning, the size of our homes, all the waste that is built into the American way of life, we would have a long list by the end of a single day. With any kind of analysis, we could find lots of ways, not just to suck it up, but also to improve the quality of life that we now live. And I'm going to come back and talk a bit about that also. Here, as we think about energy policy, we're in an election year, what should we be thinking about? And I'm going to suggest a couple of different criteria. One is that whatever we do can't cause other problems. This shouldn't be a matter of problem switching, but rather problem solving. We have to find ways that solutions, in Wendell Berry's great phrase, solve for pattern. That we have to think of security as the end result of lots of other sorts of decisions, kind of the right-hand side of an equation, but there are lots of other parts of that equation, but security and prosperity by design. Whatever we propose, I'm going to come back to this in just a moment, has to be technically feasible in the near term. It doesn't help us if it's something that can happen 50 years out. The problem identified at the very beginning is we have got to deflect carbon emissions much sooner than we thought even 4 or 5 years ago. 450 parts per million is coming up on us very, very quickly. And it isn't just CO2, it's CO2 equivalent. It's all of those heat-trapping gases. Whatever we do has got to be competitive. The right metric will include dollars spent and carbon removed. This is why very expensive options like nuclear power aren't going to be very competitive. And then things have got to be deployed very quickly. We simply don't have time. Time, again, is not our friend here. We've spent our margin of error. And then hopefully what we do is part of a resilient, redundant, and repairable kind of economy. So let's look at the options. We're being told that we can have something called clean coal. That is an oxymoron. This is Dick Cheney's energy plan, or Dick Cheney's relative bunkers. I'm not sure. This is his energy plan. Dick Cheney wants to build 150 coal-fired power plants around the country. If that happens, and if they operate to the end of their expected lifetime, they'll emit, we're told, more carbon than we emitted as a country from 1750 until about the year 2000. Ball game is over. Forget a survivable future, forget your grandchildren. The life cycle of coal, from mining, washing, the removal of sulfur dioxide from the coal, transport, combustion, ash disposal, ashes are toxic also, and CO2 sequestration, is a complicated life cycle. There's nothing particularly clean or good about any one of these things. Near where I live, this is called mountaintop removal. And the Appalachians, if you can pardon my artwork, look something like this. There are 35 layers of coal throughout the Appalachians. You can see some of these in dark lines here on the screen. This used to be one of the most fecund forests in the world, and also pretty good at sequestering carbon. It's now being leveled to get at maybe 10 or at the outside 20 years supply of coal. What's taken out of mountaintops like this represents 3% of the U.S. coal supply. But what is interesting, when you level the mountains, not only do you destroy an ecosystem and leave behind lots of ruin, including, you can't see it in this, slurry ponds where they wash the coal, but you also reduce the potential ever to use those mountains for wind power sites in perpetuity. So you drop the mountain the first 300 feet, you lose one full wind category, winds measured 1 to 7, give or take. Drop it the next 500 feet, you lose 2 more wind categories. So effectively in places like Appalachia, when you get out a few years of, quote, cheap coal, unquote, you've destroyed forever the possibility that you could generate wind from those sites. Carbon sequestration, of which we're hearing a great deal now, is a matter of taking supercritical carbon from 600 to 1,000 coal-fired power plants and assuming you can get it underground someplace relatively close to that particular power plant. Is it feasible? Frankly, no one knows. A recent study by MIT, published this past spring, has enough caveats in that to choke a horse. Maybe, maybe not, but it would take 10 or 20 years of research to find out. Can you hold carbon underground in perpetuity? Well, again, no one knows. It hasn't been done. And if you can't hold carbon underground forever, what was the point in the first place? What cost would be imposed to a kilowatt hour of electricity by doing this? And how does that compare to going to the other side of the energy equation and increasing efficiency or using renewables? And then the energy in, energy out, the energy return on investment. How much energy does it take to build all the sequestration and so forth? How much do you get out of it? All those hard questions have to be asked. Well, what about nuclear power? We hear that there is a nuclear revival, and there's some of our friends in this movement who now believe that nuclear power is a good option. It's always been an expensive way to boil water, as Amory Lovins once put it. This is a site I got to know fairly well because this is the Davis-Besse nuclear power plant located about 50 miles from where I live. A few years ago, it came very close. No one is saying exactly how close, but the word very probably fits it well enough. Very close to a nuclear meltdown. The problem was discovered when a workman doing maintenance around the containment vessel happened to lean up against a pipe, and the pipe gave way and showed a roughly football diameter sized hole in the containment vessel. How close it came to a loss of coolant accident, well, they don't know. They shut the plant down for a couple of years, but nuclear has lots of problems. It is the most subsidized energy form on Earth, including in France. It is always suffered from safety issues, and they don't go away. We're told that it is safe, but if you read the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's reports in some detail, you find out that safety hasn't been nearly as good as it is said to be. Weapons, if you can make a reactor, if you develop nuclear power as a major source of power, you can make bombs, and this is part of the issue with Iran right now, but it's also true everywhere in the world. The cost of nuclear power has always been prohibitive, and without subsidies, the private market would not touch it. The net energy issues have always been a point. In other words, if you look at, what are you telling me? If you look at the entire fuel cycle, from mining, enrichment, all the way through waste storage, the whole energy array of subsidies that go into this, and subtract what a reactor will produce over the course of its expected lifetime. Is it positive or negative? It's positive. How much is it positive? And frankly, we don't know. There was some evidence that when all the adding was, or all the subtracting was done, in the words of the old country song, there really wasn't much to add. And then there's the issue of waste storage. We really don't know what to do with the waste. We've never figured that out. Somebody once said that an effort to find good places to store nuclear waste was a very good way to discover geologic fault lines. And then there is civil liberties issues. Classic article written in the Harvard Civil Liberties Civil Law Review in 1975 by Russell Ayers laid this out in some detail. Why, if you have a society that is powered by nuclear power plants, this Faustian bargain in Alvin Weinberg's words, why that society will have to have surveillance. And then multiply that argument now by what we know of terrorism and the need for more surveillance, theoretically, or we're told, to keep ourselves safe. Fuel enrichment, construction costs, insurance costs, the Price-Anderson Act, which guarantees that you and I will pay for most of the costs of a major accident, decommissioning, waste storage, and so forth. Nuclear power has always been and will always be, until there is some kind of very expensive breakthrough, a very expensive way to go. Well, how about biofuels? Well, lots of work on this, and part of the issue with biofuels has to do with how much they're subsidized. Corn is already, last year, was subsidized at the level of nearly $9 billion. Ethanol blenders get the 51 cents per gallon subsidy. But down here at the bottom of this list, you see that we run into all kinds of other issues. That if we were to devote the entire corn crop to corn-based ethanol, that'd be about 12% of our current gasoline supply. That's not a bargain, but we also have to think about what happens to the cropland and what happens to these dead zones down in the Gulf of Mexico. And then there is this little issue of ecological or energetic accounting. When you begin to look at oil from Spindletop up here was probably 100 or 200 to 1. You could put in 1 unit of energy, take out 100 to 200 units of energy. Pretty good deal. But those days are over. We've passed, or we are approaching the point of peak oil, not production, but extraction, as you know, as you heard yesterday. And so we're coming down the energy. This is a more exciting talk than I had planned on giving. And if the music is country western, I'll just start singing. That'll be. But you get down to these. This is not bad, but you're not going to fly F-16s or F-18s with an energy return on investment like that. What do we tell the public? Well, let's start with we have better alternatives, less subsidized. It isn't all doom and gloom. There are much better ways to go, and it began to look like this. We've known about this for a long time. There was the Paley Commission report in 1952. William Paley, the former head of the CBS News Corporation, Broadcasting Corporation, thought that we could have 13 million homes solar heated by the year 1975. Atomic Energy Commission, 1974, much of the same thing. But it didn't happen, not because it was out-technologized, it was simply out-subsidized. Amory Lovin's famous warning about soft paths, or prediction, this is a soft path he predicted, this is his hard path. We've kind of been on that. And then Lovin's made a long list of good things that would come out of efficiency in renewables, and nobody has ever refuted that list. We have always had, for 30 or 40 years, we've had better alternatives, but they were not politically powerful, and we have to ask why. Then, just recently, this past year, the American Solar Energy Society released a report which, among other things, says that efficiency in renewables have the potential to provide most, if not all, of U.S. carbon emissions reductions that will be needed to help limit carbon to 450 to 500 parts per million. This is still mostly without sucking it up, but sucking it up gets you well over the top. This is what California has done. This is U.S. energy consumption on average per household. This is California. What California did was to look very carefully at things like demand-side management. A long story, but going to the other side of the equation and helping people acquire efficient refrigerators and lighting and compressors and so forth, and begin to pull demand down by increasing price. And if you pay roughly the same, if you pay a higher price but use less, you can roughly break even, which they have done. If you bought a refrigerator in 1975 or some such, you'd buy a machine that used 1,500 kilowatt hours of electricity, but state-of-the-art now is just a bit above 200 kilowatt hours of electricity. And so technological improvement is a possibility. That is real. When the Solar Energy Society looked at the U.S. In a variety of forms, this being metric and different kind of things, they found that we are not an energy-poor society. We are an energy-rich society in ways we haven't envisioned. This is a roof on the Environmental Studies Center at Oberlin College. This is the first, by the way, entirely solar-powered building, I believe it's correct to say, in the United States. But you look at the cost of PV, and here's where technology is getting better. Technology is bringing the cost down. I had a student this last year take actually blueberries and make a photoelectric cell out of blueberries, which has the advantage at the end of its useful lifespan, you eat it. This is the market for PV. And this is the United States. You'll see here, this is Japan, and you'll notice that the technology developed in the United States was most marketed and developed by the Japanese. This is our new senator in the state of Ohio, elected last year, Sherrod Brown. This is a second array that we have at the Lewis Center. This is a 100 kW array. Just after the photograph was taken, Sherrod asked me, where did you buy this? And I said, well, we bought this. Our choices were to buy it in Germany or buy it in Japan. And of course, the irony was that 24 miles away at the NASA Glenn Space Center, a lot of the technology and a lot of the production techniques were first developed 24 miles from this site. But we pay unemployment checks in Ohio and buy our high-tech equipment overseas, including windmills. This is a wind farm near Oberlin at Bowling Green, Ohio. This is a Class 2 plus wind site. It's performing at Class 3 plus. The figures here are employment figures and so forth, and GNP numbers from the Apollo project, but we have alternatives. And again, wind is growing at better than 40% per year. Panacea? No. Better alternative? Absolutely. This is a wind map of the United States developed by NREL, and this is kind of the Saudi Arabia of wind, as people like to call it. Wes Jackson pointed out last year to me that if you take 4 states, North Dakota, Texas, Kansas, and South Dakota in that order, there's enough wind potential in those 4 states alone to meet the U.S. electrical budget. Moving the electrons around is a different issue, but we have alternatives. And if you look at the cost curves for renewable energy, they're falling in virtually every field, much more dramatically than could have been predicted even 10 years ago. Now, I want to wrap this up and I want to talk politics. What to tell the public? This isn't just a technical crisis or an economic issue. This is a global emergency. And in virtually every way, it is a political crisis. It's been brought on us by a political failure that we can never permit again. We can never risk losing the entire planet and the future of the human race to political ineptitude and stupidity. What do we do about it? Well, Abraham Lincoln had a premonition. This is from a letter he written in 1864 about the power of corporations. Corporations have, he wrote, been enthroned in an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudice of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. We are perilously close to that world. The Supreme Court decision, the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific decision, one landmark in American constitutional law, is said to have given the power of personhood to corporations. You and I are persons. We're limited to one life. We can be in one place at one time. Our assets are limited. We have a conscience and so forth. Corporations are an abstraction. They can be global, all around the world. To give them the power of personhood as protected in the Bill of Rights was as mischievous a way to organize human affairs as you could imagine. To say that you and I have free speech is one thing. To say corporations with lots of money have free speech and the expenditure of money is a form of free speech, that is a wholly different thing. What it's done is to give the power of corporations to buy policy, as we have seen in spades in the past 6 years. Can we build a greener capitalism? Well, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I believe possible. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I don't think it's possible. On Sunday, I don't have an opinion. But there is lots of corporate movement in this area, and I would like to see that go as far as it can possibly go. Lots of corporations have signed up to do lots of interesting sorts of things, including, of course, Walmart. But it's a mixed bag. That is a Toyota Prius. That happens to be Elaine in my car. But Toyota also turns around, does some boneheaded thing like making the Tundra, which is an energy-efficient hog. And then no corporation. And as far as I know, the corporate greening movement isn't yet talking about equity and fairness and decency and democracy. They're still spending a good bit of their money lobbying for all the wrong kinds of things, supporting people of all the wrong kinds of ways that do all the wrong kinds of things, but greening their supply chains. It isn't enough to just try to green a supply chain. The problems are much more serious than that. What do you tell the public? Well, how about starting again with the founding fathers, in this case James Madison, who more than anybody else was the author of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He said a popular government without information or the means to acquire it is either prologue to a farce or a tragedy or perhaps both. And then you begin to look at how information is disseminated in this country. The Fairness Doctrine, established in 1949 by the Federal Communications Commission, simply said, and it actually had long precedent before 1949, but it simply said that to own a license to a television or radio station, the public commons, that's what you and I own. It's not theirs, it's ours. To own a license, you have to provide all sides of an issue, and if you don't, we, the people, can take you to court. Or your license could be suspended by the Federal Communications Commission. That was a democratic way to control, in some ways, what went out over the airwaves, as was the ownership of radio stations, which has now become much more concentrated. Telecommunications Act of 1996. This, by the way, was suspended in 1987 by Reagan. It actually is still on the books. Technically, it could be still implemented if there was the will to do it. But it has effectively been suspended, and profitability is now the criteria for holding a license to the public airwaves. Telecommunications Act of 1996 said that single corporations can own cross-media serving the same media market. So one corporation can own radio stations, televisions, and newspapers, and presumably internet news access or news outlets, all in the same market. And so the level of concentration went up. And so you see Clear Channel, 1,200 radio stations around the country, and so forth. When the World News Association looked at world press in terms of freedom of the press, we in the United States rank 27th. James Madison would roll over in his grave were he to know. What this means is that a good bit of what the public hears over the airwaves is simply biased or distorted. Some of it is just plain wrong and known to be wrong. A recent study of radio content on radio talk shows shows that 91% across the country, 91% of all talk radio is conservative. 9% is progressive. Are you with me? This means that to try to mobilize the public for a serious kind of conversation about the human future is very difficult because the public airways, this public commons that you and I own, has been preempted by corporations. Ben Bedikian wrote his Media Monopoly in 1980, and he complained in that book, this classic study of American media, that there were only 50 major media outlets, and now we're down to 6. Some would put it at 4, but that includes, of course, Fox News, which is an oxymoron. The result is that our language has been corrupted. Words that we once took for granted, logical assumptions that we once believed in, data and logic and so forth have been tossed out the window in ways that George Orwell would have understood and appreciated. One step is to reclaim our public words. Patriotism. Why is it patriotism suddenly meant driving an SUV to the shopping mall bearing an American flag and a bumper sticker saying, "God bless America," but no sacrifice? Our words and our language have got to be reclaimed if we're to make this transition. Will the public support it? I think so. I think the public, despite all the effort to distort and corrupt public dialogue, the public has remained remarkably aware of what really is what. Invest in solar and wind, 91%. Efficient appliances, this is mandate. Efficient appliances, 87%. 86% efficient buildings, and so forth. In a more recent poll, New York Times and CBS poll, human activity contributing to climate change, 84% say yes. We'll pay more for solar and wind electricity, 75% yes. Mandate fuel-efficient cars, again, 92%. Pay more for gas if the money went to research, 64%. Trade off environment over economy, 52%. Environment be worse for our children. Look at that number, 57%. And these are people not terribly well informed about totally what is at stake, but 57% believe that they are passing on a degraded world to their children and grandchildren. Is the public ready? Well, I think the public is ready for some more change. California and the New England states and now Florida have all committed to carbon reduction targets. There is movement in Congress now with some legislation. The Sanders and Boxman and Waxman bill, of course, being the best down here, getting the most rapid carbon reductions. But Congress is now debating cap and trade systems. There are other alternatives being talked about, including Peter Barnes' proposal made in Capitalism 3.0, a book I recommend that you read, for a global cap and trade system and the creation of an earth trust or a sky trust by which every person is given a check at the end of the year. Whether you think I think it's a good idea or not, I don't particularly in that case, but imagine saying that we own the sky. And if you want to pollute it, you have got to pay. And when you pay, the money doesn't go to some vague government bureaucracy. It comes back directly to citizens or to efforts to eliminate the pollution in the first place. What do we tell the people? Well, after saying that you really ought to suck it up, that this is a situation more dangerous than any we have ever encountered in our career as a species on the earth, I think we ought to say that life in a greenhouse world, if we move quickly, doesn't have to be all bad, and every one of you in this room knows this. Whether it's smaller houses or rooftop gardens and green roofs or smaller cars or more bike trails, look at the list here, and you could extend this list indefinitely. Is this awful? I don't think so. And what it does is to begin to expose something that we haven't been willing to talk about politically. Imagine a politician beginning to talk about the happiness curve. You know, GNP has been going up like this, but happiness curves all show that happiness in this country peaked, what, about 1957? In my case, it was 1962, but that's another matter. But in 1957, we were as happy as we were going to get. Now, it doesn't mean that we do without in sackcloth and ashes. It just means what we've known ever since Plato and Aristotle thought about this is only so much makes you happy. And after a while, it's better poetry, better friends, better bowling leagues, better baseball, local gardens and farms, and better food. It's the things that make quality of life. But we've known that for a while. And it isn't GNP. And at some point, as the great economist Herman Daly points out, there's such a thing as ILF. Not just growth, but we get more and more stuff that we really don't want. What to tell the public? I want to wrap up with this point. Well, we have to say to the public that this is the ball game. This is about our children. It's about the human future. It's about what we are as a species. It is about nothing else. This isn't tinkering at the margins. This isn't screwing in a couple of compact fluorescent light bulbs and buying a Prius. That isn't remotely enough. The losers will be posterity, and we have a legal handle on this issue. There are a group of us around some law schools trying to put together a case for the rights of posterity. The word is only used once in the U.S. Constitution in the preamble. The preamble says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." But there's no case law. There is no precedent that says posterity has legal standing. That's what we're trying to attack. We want to make the case that where the actions of one generation can deprive future generations of life and liberty and property, and that's the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment, then they ought to and should have standing in those decisions. There ought to be trustees appointed to speak for the rights of the future where their life, liberty, and property is in jeopardy. We have a noble history as a nation. It isn't all good. Slavery was part of it. Subjugation of native peoples is part of it. Wars that we should not have fought has been part of it, and it hasn't gotten necessarily better in the last few years. But we have a noble history that is adapted to this kind of change. The Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, Roosevelt's second inaugural address, or second Bill of Rights in 1944, the least known of the four on the screen. We have the materials by which we could begin to reshape American politics in a dramatically different direction. And to sum those, how about this for a principle that no generation has the right to alter the Earth's biogeochemical cycles or impair the stability and integrity and beauty of biotic systems, the consequences of which would be a form of intergenerational remote tyranny that would deprive all posterity of life and liberty and property. That is the basis for a very different politics. And if you read that, you can hear Thomas Jefferson, a bit of James Madison, Abraham Lincoln, Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, Bill McDonough, Wes Jackson. You can hear lots and lots of, many of you in this room. That is the principle around which our politics need to be organized. Now, posterity for Elaine and me has faces. These are our grandchildren. They just happen to be the three most beautiful kids born in the past 1,000 years. Their children, not yet born, and their grandchildren have no standing relative to whether there is a habitable planet or not, as the law now exists. That is wrong. That ought to be talked about. If we're going to tell the people anything, it is that the future of your children and their children, as far out as you can possibly imagine, is on the line. And one last note here. When this all boils down into a single agenda, Tom Berry, who is in his early 90s now and one of the great minds of the past 50 years, Thomas Berry wrote a book called The Great Work. And in the book, he describes the great work of every generation. No one ever picks their great work. And in wartime, if that's what the great work happened to be, those guys who fought and died over slavery in the U.S. Civil War, they didn't really want to go fight in places like Antietam or Gettysburg or the wilderness of Spotsylvania or whatever, but that was called on, they were called on to do that. And that was their duty, and they did it. And that was wartime, that was the great work, and we are a better nation because of that sacrifice. We've been better had other people upstream from that event thought to avoid war, but that wasn't the case. And the same is true about the generation now passing the scene that Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation. But we have it on high authority that the great work is something that every generation has to do. Our great work looks like this. Number one, we've got to deal with this biophysical reality. We've got to balance the carbon books, as somebody once put it. We have got to stabilize and then begin rapidly to reduce all greenhouse gases, that basket of 6 and a few others that we ought to include. But that is number one. We've got to balance those books, probably the nitrogen cycle as well. We have to make a rapid transition to efficiency and renewables. Time, again, is not our friend. We're not the rich nation we think. We don't have the luxury of having decades to think about this or do long-term research. This is here. It's now. We've got to be about this work. Number three, we've got to think about how those decisions impact others. We've got to build a world secure by design. Imagine a world in which every kid has a right to a decent life, education, home, nutrition, medical care. That's a world in which terrorism will be much less likely. But that's a world in which we design and we think, how do we solve this problem like a quadratic equation that has these benefits over here, and we know how to do that. And then fourth, how about rethinking our politics? Away from competitive left-right internal dialogue that is destructive to something that is rather different. How about seeing ourselves as trustees? And that fits both left and right. Edmund Burke, the founder of modern conservatism in a great book in 1790, Reflections on the Revolution in France, talked about every generation is no more than a trustee, midway between a distant past and a distant future. And their job, as he put it, was to pass on an entailed inheritance. And what he meant by that was laws and institutions and customs and so forth. And if he were here now and knew what we now know, he would be saying something like, well, you have to pass those things on, yes, but you have to pass on also the ecological requisites, clean air, clean water, biological diversity, and a stable climate on which all of those things rest. And he would agree to that. Thomas Jefferson, founder of modern radical politics, all the way on the other side of the spectrum. Thomas Jefferson believed his entire life that no generation had the right to put succeeding generations in debt. And you can begin to see that if Jefferson were here now, he would also agree that debt meant not just financial debt, but also ecological debt. And were Jefferson here with Burke, we could begin to see the outlines of a very different kind of politics, one that goes from being right, left at each other's throats like this to being with or against the interests of posterity and future generations. The politics of trusteeship, not partisanship. And then finally, when you begin to think about this, your work and mine and the work of so many of you in this room, and I think of Dan Kemmis here and his great work on politics and the books he's written, and Janine Benyus and biomimicry, and Wes Jackson, sustainable and natural systems agriculture. This work is about life, and it's sacred in every way we could ever make it. Life and living and holy and health and healing, these are all words that are joined at the root. This movement is finally a sacred movement. It's about the preservation of life. Let's be about it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm George Breed. I'm from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I applaud your use of data. I applaud your perspective on politics. It's really about future generations versus current generation. However, I'm confused that you spoke on the solution side only to the US. You did not, if you were addressing China versus India versus European Union, would you be giving a different presentation on the solution side?
Oh, a good question. Thanks for asking it. All that you and I, for the most part, can do is, as U.S. citizens, is to deal with U.S. issues. And there are several answers along that line. One is to say that the United States is the largest emitter of heat-trapping gases. We are the problem. We've got to deal with ourselves first and foremost. Secondly, it isn't just that we're the largest emitter, we are also the standard setter for a good bit of the rest of the world. And so what we do matters, not just in terms of sheer economic impact, but also because of sheer example. And imagine the United States committed to balancing its carbon budget. 80% reduction is in the Boxer-Sanders bill by 2050 and so forth, but moving down that road as rapidly as we can do it, possibly, then helping other countries to follow along. So number one, the U.S. is the leverage point in this issue. If we don't move, then we're not going to solve this. And number two, we are still taken to be the, I guess, the example for much of the rest of the world. Would the talk be different if it was given in China or India? Yeah, to some degree, yes, it would. The politics part would be completely different. But we are the leverage point, and that's why in a talk like this before this particular audience, I think we have to stress what we do in the United States. But thanks for that question.
Before I ask my question, I wanted to pass along a quote I saw recently by Ogden Nash. He said that prosperity was good for a while, and then it just went on and on. I mean, excuse me, progress was good for a while, and then it went on and on and on. My question is, I'm confused about carbon offsets. Can you talk a little bit about that business of carbon offsets?
I don't think that there are two major policy issues here. One is carbon offsets, and the other is cap and trade systems. I didn't talk much about that. Carbon offsets are a way to kind of have your cake and eat it too. Two comments. One is that when you, let's say, take a trip from Cleveland to Missoula, Montana, you can purchase carbon offsets for the carbon emitted from that plane ride. So you take the plane ride, you pay cash to a third party to do something somewhere else in the world, plant trees or build windmills or whatever, that purportedly offsets in a particular dollar carbon ton ratio the amount of carbon released by your travel. Now, the difficulty with that is that we don't know yet very effectively how honest those are. I think most of them are fairly sincere, but we don't know how honest and effective they are. One of the downsides is it says I can have my life as I now live it and make no other sacrifice and change, which I think is also a problem. On cap and trade issues, that may be another matter people want to talk about, but that is modeled after the Clean Air Act of 1990, which set a cap on total emissions of sulfur dioxide. And once the cap was set, then companies were given the right, grandfathered into the right to auction off the property that they then had in sulfur dioxide. So those that could move cheaply did it, and it sold their permits to those who could do it only more expensively. So that the lingo is beginning to shift here, and those are two of the major ways in which it's changed. Yes? Over here.
How do you handle the issue of air traffic and its ramifications with global warming or global climate change?
Air travel? It's George Monbiot, the British columnist for The Guardian, has a recent analysis that says that carbon emitted at 35,000 feet is something like, his number I think is something like 3 times more or 3 times worse than carbon emitted at ground level. I still fly airplanes, or fly in airplanes. I think 50 years or sooner out, we're not going to be flying around the way that we do now. And the arrangements will have to be very different. Personally, I would love to see us, as a nation, commit to getting back on track again, metaphorically and in reality, building a high-speed train system to offset a good portion of what travel we now do by airplane. Certainly short distances, like Cleveland, Ohio, to Boston, Washington, New York, ought to be done by high-speed rail. But your question is a good one. It's going to be one of those things that we're going to have to, I think, rethink dramatically. And efficiency and airlines are not going to do it. There's no way to use, as far as I can tell, biofuels, although there's some research in this, for aircraft. You're certainly not going to use hydrogen because it's way too prohibitively expensive and bulky and heavy and all that. So I think there are some bottlenecks ahead of us and some things that we won't do. George Monbiot also puts it that our generation lives better than people have ever lived, and better than people ever will live. And I think that's a pretty good way to think about it.
The concept of cap and trade has been fairly successful in the Clean Air Act area and very likely will be a regulatory model that we'll be moving toward. It will be dependent upon the concept of carbon sequestration. And I gather from your comments that we're still novel and trying to figure out where to go. About 15 years ago, a professor from Canada made the point that actually algae is far more effective at capturing carbon dioxide than trees are. And he was at that point urging we needed algae ponds everywhere. Obviously, that's not yet occurred. And yet we are moving towards a nutrient standard for wastewater plants and urban runoff that will be so severe that it will have to force us into use of algae and other methods for trying to extract nutrients rather than using reverse osmosis. And I'm just wondering what's going on in the world of algae as a direction for carbon sequestration and, of course, in the ultimate question of burial or removal.
Yeah, I don't have the expertise to answer that. Somebody maybe in the audience does, but I don't. I think but your question is a good question. I think there will be lots of technological development. The foundation that I work with is funding a project called algal turf scrubbing to take out of relatively minimally polluted water, pull the carbon and pollutants out of it. It has some climate impact, or could have some climate impact, but probably not as much as we need. In terms of sequestration, the term is typically applied to carbon coming out of coal-fired power plants. As you saw from my slides and the comments I made, I don't believe that can compete with efficiency and renewables and in any kind of time frame that we will have to meet. So I'm not a big fan of sequestration at this point. And I think one of the hidden things in the political dialogue, one of the hidden assumptions, is that we can keep the American way of life going as it has been going without any kind of serious redefinition by lots of technological gadgetry like sequestration. And I don't believe it. I don't think the numbers are there to support the cost of it. The feasibility of carbon sequestration on a large scale has not been established. The MIT report talks about 10 years or longer after a massive crash course. But you compare that statement with Jim Hansen's statement 2 years ago that we only have 10 years to reach that flexion point where carbon actually begins to go down. And so this is the hard part, I think, in this debate, to begin to understand that climate scientists are telling us that we are very perilously close to those 12 tipping points and runaway climate change. And at that point, all bets are off. Now, that doesn't play well in evening news, and that's dismissed as doom and gloom and so forth, but I think that is simply, as far as I can read the science, that is the handwriting on the wall. And so I don't happen to believe, the technology can sure do a whole lot better for us, but it has to be the technology that exists here and now and can be deployed very rapidly. Two more? Okay.
Okay. Ted Bacek, thank you for the truly excellent presentation. I would like to comment on carbon sequestration as an earth scientist, and the answer is very similar to yours. No, it can be sometimes very limited, and it's not going to do the job for geological reasons and cost reasons. The problem of algae is a different one. There's a certain confusion of scales. That is, a small-scale cleanup of municipal waste is confused with cleaning up CO2 from a 1,000 megawatt power station, which is not going to happen. However, my real question is somewhat different. As so many others, you have stayed very carefully from the issue of population. And as someone who tracks CO2 emissions every year, I can see that despite all the talk, global and local, CO2 emissions, thank you very much, are increasing along exactly the same trend as they have 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. And much of this is linked to the increase of population. So, on that list, is there an item saying we shall try to limit population growth, or there isn't?
Ted, thanks for the question. Yes, I agree. I don't see a way that 6.5 billion people can be made sustainable, or 8 or 9 or 10 billion people, which is where we're headed. I don't think that's possible. A couple of us last night were talking about the things that have disappeared from the public dialogue. The word overshoot among them, carrying capacity, population has disappeared from the public discourse, and so about environment, I think you're right, it ought to be brought back on the table. Now, the population debate has changed dramatically. In 1974 at the Bucharest conference, it was all about how you all over there in third world areas have got to stop breeding. By the time it got to Egypt, it was about reproductive rights, and by the time the Beijing conference happened, it was reproductive rights and consumption. And so it's a more complicated thing than we thought. But this means going back and giving serious attention to family planning programs. It means giving serious attention to changing things like the tax breaks you get for having 3, 4, 5 kids are all the same number. It means having people pay more, but it certainly would begin with a dialogue about how many of us are on the planet and how many can live decent lives. So thanks for the question. I agree with the import behind it.
I live 120 miles northwest of here in Missoula, and last year a lightning hit a tree across the creek from us. The local ranger district personnel came up and felled it. It was 48 inches on the butt. I've done some studying of the growth rings on that, which is an indicator of the amount of moisture. And it's quite interesting to see what we come up with the periods of drought. There's no transition into them. They start immediately and they end immediately. And some of them are 2 to 8 years. 20 and 30. One of them real distinct is the year 1601 to 1621. I call it random climatic cycles. There's no predictability to it. And what I'd like to know is, are there any other studies along these lines nationwide or internationally that could do some comparative analysis on this? Not that we can do anything about it, but it would be just interesting to know.
You mean drought cycles in particular?
That's correct.
I don't know much of the literature on specifically on drought. I think the drought and weather patterns are cyclical. There are lots of different things. Earth's orbit around the sun and all kinds of things involved in it. But I think what we do know is that the human forcing of climate, whatever phase climate might be in, human forcing of it will amplify either a cooling or warming trend, and then everything else that occurs along with that. And the evidence, as far as I can tell, that the evidence, virtually all of it, is saying the same thing. Mid-continent areas everywhere around the planet get hotter and get drier. But the difficulty, I think, in predicting anything of the kind is that the Earth behaves one way, will behave one way, with a forcing, let's say, of 280 parts per million. That was a pre-industrial level. But it's going to be different at 330, 350, 400, 450, 500, and whatever. And this is where we're playing climate roulette. We don't know. And I think the concern I would have would be not with drought, which no one will predict specifically for any given area, but the likelihood of drought will increase for lots of areas. In some places it will decrease. Rainfall will increase pretty dramatically in some areas. So climate roulette is kind of like fasten your seatbelt and hang on, because it's going to get highly unstable. But it will be a changing kind of instability. It'll change at various intervals along that continuum in ways that will surprise us. Thanks for the question. Yes.
Yeah, David, my name's Steve Loken. I live here in Missoula, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come to Missoula and talk to us. I remember a quote that I read from the chiefs of staff in the Pentagon a few years ago. They said, inspiration without implementation is hallucination. And what you've done is you've inspired us and you've given us examples of implementation. But I think the reason I'm so mad at global warming is that it so disempowers us as individuals in the larger picture. And it disempowers us because it disenables us to believe that we can do anything on a local level, on a community level, or even on a neighborhood level to change. And global warming and carbon dioxide is just out there. It's space, it's air, and yet we refuse to look at the local things in our community that could re-empower and reinvigorate our communities, our economics, our food, our transportation, our health, and revisit how we can really make this a better place to live. I'm on the Governor's Global Warming Advisory Task Force, and just yesterday we heard him talk about more and more and more of everything. And it seems to me that we're at a point now where we could have more weatherization of low-income homes in Montana. There's 83,000 of them that qualify. Last year we insulated 1,700 of them. Where is the will to incentivize less? Where is the will to incentivize conservation and reduction of things? Because we full know well there's lots of incentives for more, for bigger, and more centralized. And it seems to me that the real question to get to implementation is, how do we incentivize less of everything? Could you answer that one?
Steve, thanks for your work too, Steve. Nice to see you. Wow. I'll stumble around here for most of your lunch period. And Steve, you've raised a really good issue. Let me make two comments back. One is, at the global scale, we've come to the point where this has to be a global solution. We will have to figure out how what we do fits with the Chinese and Indians and Europeans and everyone else. This is going to have to be global. The atmosphere is totally indifferent as to the national point of origin of any heat-trapping gas. And so we could do it all right in Missoula or Oberlin or even in the United States and still lose the ball game because China didn't come along. And so we've got to take this to a global scale without further delay. Imagine a speech given by a president of the United States, first apologizing for terror, for a war on terror, and for torturing people that didn't need or should not ever have been tortured, and then talking about a climate policy for the whole planet and where we fit, and laying that out. And that would be a speech that would have overtones of Martin Luther King, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and then you fill in the blanks as to others. But that's the kind of leadership we need. Second is, you're exactly right, that a good bit of the actual implementation is going to have to be on the ground. The link between national and global issues, I think, and the mobilization of on-the-ground activities in places like Missoula or Oberlin, Ohio, I think are going to be federal policies in this case, or global policies that first of all put a monetary value to carbon, and then begin to create the kind of incentives, taxes and subsidies that we are very good. We know how these things work, that provide people incentives to do those kinds of things. The solar incentive in the 1970s and 80s that was terminated during the Reagan administration was great. It was fostering a solar revolution. We know how to spend federal money very effectively to get $5, $10, $20, $100 per every dollar publicly that we spend. Now, that does not require federal intrusion. That's different than regulation. It is incentivizing exactly what you're talking about. One last comment. I think you're right that it's very easy to look at this and despair. The problem is daunting, and we have to have the courage to stare down the barrel at this. It is the first global crisis we have ever faced, and it could be the last. That's the point. And time, again, is not our friend. Money is not our friend. We have to move on this more rapidly than we have ever moved on anything before. Hanson's 10 years ought to be taken, I think, as kind of a baseline. And this is that's one very well-informed person saying you don't go past 450, but there are dozens and dozens of others where we take security warnings about military threats and spend trillions. We've managed to ignore scientific warnings to the point where we now stand, I think, at the brink of very serious peril. Last question.
There's one after me. I promised it. David, this is kind of addressing that last question. It's an idea. You mentioned the book Capitalism 3.0 by Peter Barnes. And what he's talking about in that book is expanding the commons and protecting interests beyond water and air, way beyond water and air. Health, conservation, all kinds of things. Maybe libraries, parks, all sorts of things that should be managed by trusts, perhaps like an authority. And if some of these issues that are so critical could be taken out of the realm of politics, perhaps even a trust managing oil and gas, all kinds of things, and their whole purpose is to protect and enhance whatever that community common asset is, we might be able to perpetuate a move towards protecting long-term the vital interests you're talking about. Could you comment on that and that possibility?
First of all, Peter Barnes' book is it's Capitalism 3.0, and I recommend that you read it. It started a major dialogue with people. I take exception to the idea of giving everybody on the planet a check. I mean, it works the way the Alaskan oil revenues were managed. But in some way, revenues need to be plowed back to help the people most disadvantaged. John, I think where we are, if we go back in time and remember what you learn about American history in the period, say, 1760 to, let's bracket this around the year 1800, by the time political parties are invented. We went through, in a microcosm, a period of incredible political fertility. The pamphleteering that went on, Thomas Paine's work, Benjamin Franklin's writings, literally hundreds of people were writing and thinking about political life and political activities. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, there were two of them, and then the Federalist Papers, and the state papers. I think internationally, nationally and internationally, we need to go through something like that politically fecund era. We need to be creative again about the way we conduct public business and who owns what and by what standards of accountability. The fear, and I had the slide here of Abraham Lincoln's fears about corporate power, but Thomas Jefferson had the same fears. Madison had the same fears. Most of them thought that things would work out badly in time, and I think they've come to the brink, or that realization has come to nearly to fruition. We've assigned unaccountable power to people whose names we don't know, whose decisions we don't know very well, and who have no accountability to us or to future generations. So the answer to your question, or it's not an answer, just a comment back, is I think that we need to be as politically creative in ways that they were for their time, we have to be for our time. And again, time isn't our friend. We've got to be about this very quickly. But we have a backlog of ideas. We do have the ideas of trusteeship. Peter Brown's book on trusteeship is worth pulling off the shelf. It's a 1995 Boston Beacon Press book, still in print. There is lots of good stuff out there. What is striking to me is how little of this seems to dent the political dialogue, even as we move up toward this electoral season of 2008. This needs to be on the agenda, and it is not yet on the agenda. If we are to calibrate our political activities with the magnitude, the scope, and seriousness of this crisis of climate and other things, as Tad pointed out, population is certainly part of it. We need to have a much bigger conversation than we're now having, and eventually it will have to be global. It'll be local for sure, as you see in zoning decisions and growth decisions and all of that, but it has got to eventually be a global conversation. And without that conversation, I don't see really much hope. With it, I see a lot of hope. And I think the public is now, worldwide, is now moving in this direction. Of those 6.5 billion people on the planet, imagine 20 or 30 years ago saying that 1.2 billion would protest a war. We couldn't have believed that. But 1.2 billion or more did protest the onset of the invasion of Iraq. Whatever your view on the war is, that is a major transformation. Al Gore, in his recent book on politics, Assault on Reason, says that the internet, he puts a lot of faith in the internet. I don't put as much faith in it, but it certainly is changing political realities. We have ways to communicate now that we never had before. And we have reason to communicate and talk together that we never had before either. So we stand poised at that point in history that if we get it right and start this conversation, I think the human future can be improved dramatically. That's the hopeful side. Am I optimistic that it's going to happen? Not necessarily. But everybody in this room has their sleeves rolled up, and everybody's working to change these odds. And I think that if I was betting, I would bet that we would. One last point.
I'm just very disappointed in one piece of the dialogue that we've been listening to. I was 12 years old when Pearl Harbor happened. And 18 months after that, all three of the major American automobile builders had completely retooled and were making things to help us win a war. That shows you what we can do when we're really threatened. And what I want to try to emphasize is to say that we need to be talking about the emergency that we're facing, a national, an international, however you want to put it, a global emergency. It needs to be talked about almost as much as the details that you've given, and you're so good at it. So what I'm thinking is that because we don't have leadership in Washington, we have to think about creative ways to build an ever-increasing number of human beings talking about a global emergency.
Thanks for that point. I think that I believe that that's happened or is happening. There's this phrase tipping point gets used way too often, but I think in terms of public perception, there is a tipping point. I had some figures taken from the New York Times CBS poll on the screen that 84% of the public now believes that humans are, in fact, a major agent of climate change. I don't think they've gotten the salience of it yet, even remotely. And I think you're exactly right that we need to be talking about this as an emergency on a global basis. I don't disagree with anything you said. Let me make one observation, however, and it's this. World War II is a rather different, and I've used that example too, and it shows what we can do faced with a military threat that had a face on it, and faces that we learned to demonize. There were Germans and Japanese, and we learned to hate them. This cartoon character, and that was propagated through American information people, and we could respond with visceral hatred and this incredible productive effort. And Detroit doesn't make cars for 4 or 5 more years. Our crisis is a bit different. Walt Kelly once put in a Pogo cartoon back in the 70s that we've met the enemy, and he's us. Who do we hate? So we can't tap hatred. We'll have to tap something that's very different. And I think the thing that we're going to have to tap is love of life, call it biophilia or call it whatever you will, but it's very different. Second point, making stuff. I could imagine Detroit, what's left of it, making windmills and solar collectors, and we could do this on a crash basis. And would that have an impact? Yes, and I would certainly hope that that is in the offing. But I don't think we're going to make our way out of this. I think the crisis of climate and energy is too finely insinuated into everything that we do, including the way we think, that it's a very different sort of thing. I think we will have to eventually go back, and this is going to sound very academic, but by one way or another, and I do believe this is happening now also, we're going to have to go back and re-examine a good bit of the philosophy on which we have built this civilization. And this means looking at the underpinnings of Western civilization and rethinking a whole lot of things that we didn't get right. But imagine a president of the United States in a fireside chat with maybe a Ross Perot type pointer behind him and talking to the public, because we can never again bring civilization to this particular point. It isn't, as Dan Kemp said last night, that we're ever going to have a world without problems. We're going to have problems ad infinitum. But we can never again, or we would hope that we never again come to this particular brink of catastrophe. And what will we have to rethink in order to never do that again? Or to never drop another atomic device. I mean, this never again sort of pledge that we ought to make as part of a covenant with future generations, that we will never, ever jeopardize the possibility of your life. That's the abortion issue writ large. That's us aborting all future life, or a substantial part of it. So this isn't a matter of switching out gas-burning things for things that spin and sit there and collect photons. That's part of it. But there's a much bigger part of this that ought to have us examining a lot of very profoundly deep things. That's why I am encouraged that now evangelical people and religious people are starting into this dialogue. What's it mean to be human? What's it mean to live in harmony with the planet? What's it mean to live in harmony, balance, fairness with future generations, other life forms? What does that mean? And what does that cause us to do? I don't have the answers for that. There are people wiser and smarter than I am who maybe will, and I certainly will. But that's the kind of dialogue that we've got to create. Instead of a civilization built around stuff and growth, a total sham, how about a civilization built on fairness and decency and balance, and better poetry and better baseball leagues and bike trails and better communities while we're at it? That's the means to some kind of larger end. But that's a dialogue that began a long time ago. What's it mean to be human? And I think it's time to resume it after a couple hundred years of kind of the Australian equivalent of a walkabout, in which we simply didn't raise big questions. Let me close with a comment. My favorite, some of you have heard me say this before, my favorite example in history is the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And Lincoln and Douglas, fighting for a Senate seat in 1858, go around the state of Illinois, and they're talking about the big issues of their time. It's slavery and sectionalism and tariffs and so forth. And if you go back, and I recommend that you do, go back and read the text of those debates. They were profound. They dealt with those issues. For all the flaws in the arguments, they dealt with those issues. And the people that stood there in the hot sun and without the aid of mics and PowerPoint and all that sat there and listened. And you can tell they were hearing it because they would laugh, they would jeer, they would applaud. They were following those debates. Those were citizens. And those were people who took ideas seriously. And some took them serious enough to go fight for them, and some serious enough to die for them a few years later. Those were citizens. In our time, our great work here is we're called to be citizens at a scale, at a depth that we haven't begun to think of yet. Are we up to it? I believe that we are. I think that given people given a chance will respond dramatically to this. Churchill's blood, toil, tears, and sweat. On a global basis, let's be the generation that is literally the great generation. This is the generation that turned around from the brink and walked off in the sunshine, or whatever metaphor you want to use. But that's our great work. That's what we're called on to do. So thanks for the point. Thanks for the question.